Hello, historians. We're going to be talking about the 1950s and what was going on here stateside for the most part. Well, what was going on stateside is men and women liked each other very, very much, and the birth rate skyrocketed at this time, and we now have the baby boom from it. With the baby boom, well, besides babies, brought suburbs, because people were buying into the marketing that each child should have their own room. And there was this drive for us all to have independent housing, to have several bedrooms, and we were buying into a lot of this American dream that was not accessible to the majority of Americans. But there was this push, and suburbs were growing and growing and expanding. After World War II, we had a lot of soldiers, of military personnel coming home, and we put into place the GI Bill. It's actually called the Servicemen's Readjustment Act. It was put in place in 1944, and there was a whole bunch of benefits, home loans. It pays for school re-education to help them find better careers. And this was affecting a lot of people because there was about 10 million soldiers that were discharged from the military between 45 and 47, so we wanted them to be able to transition, to readjust. And people are still actually benefiting from this GI Bill. I know several of your classmates are on this. Of course, as jobs are starting to slowly decrease after the war, we have less need for production, and inflation happens. Okay, so the labor unions are starting to come back in. Remember how I said in previous lectures that the unions had promised, we're not going to strike, we're going to do our patriotic duty to keep production going, and this was under the promise that the bosses and the unions had to sit down together. Well, in 1947, the Taft-Hartley Act was a federal law that prohibited certain union practices and required disclosure of certain financial and political activities by the unions. So the unions were up in the 40s through the war, and then they slowly started losing power, being reined back in. The Republicans that were in office, remember, Roosevelt and Truman were Democrats. The Republicans have always been the pro-capital, the pro-ownership class. The Republicans used their majority to pass the Taft-Hartley Act over Truman's veto. This law prohibited many kinds of strikes and allowed states to pass right-to-work laws that Florida still has, by the way. It prohibited closed shops, which West Virginia has closed shops, so that's not entirely true. But a closed shop is the new employee has to join a union to be hired. So when I was a grocery store clerk up in West Virginia in the 1990s, Kroger was a closed shop, so I had to be in the union to get that job. It paid a lot better than the non-union jobs there. And part of this Taft-Hartley Act, it required union leaders to declare the U.S. Department of Labor that they were not communist. So remember that pledge I talked about before? Union leaders had to swear that same pledge too. Truman opposed the bill, but once again, he was overridden because the Republicans had Congress. Okay, 1948, because remember, Roosevelt died, Truman got his time in office, And Truman ran on his own, too. And they were saying Dewey's going to defeat Truman. So this is the day after Truman wins the election. The newspapers would get the publication printed the night before, and so they thought that Dewey was going to win, and here's him holding up what incredibly at the time was fake news. Dewey did not win, Truman did. So it's just a cute little picture of him saying, hey, nope, they were wrong. And here is the electoral votes. Truman got 303 to Dewey's 189. Strom Thurmond, Dixiecrat, he got 39% of the vote. Strom Thurmond was running on anti-integration policies. Not too fond of him. Okay. So, okay. Remember how I said Strom Thurmond was a racist? Truman originally had been a racist too, but by 1947 he decided to fix this and make civil rights a national issue. Hooray, changed his mind. I'm proud of him. So in 1948, Truman continued to push for civil rights, and he felt it was the right thing to do, and because he also, he knew it was the right thing to do, but he also knew that he would need the African American vote in order to win. Politics makes for interesting changes. So that was the Democrats with Truman, and then 1957, go forward 10 years, President Eisenhower signed a law providing voting protections for black known as the Civil Rights Act of 57. So there was some progress being made. This court case I have on the screen, 1948, Shelley versus Kramer, was people were selling realty and they were redlining. They were saying, okay, we can't sell to African Americans in this area. Shelley versus Kramer looked at this and said, no, this is completely illegal. You can't do that. Of course, it was still happening for a long time after, but according to the federal government, no, that's wrong and you can't do it. Oh, at this time, minimum wage was raised. So, hooray, minimum wage. At this time, you all know about the 1950s and this huge boom in tech. So out of World War II, we had been doing so much R&D. There had been so much science going on, for lack of a better phrase, that there was a ridiculous amount of tech that was created. And all this that was originally government-induced went into the private sector, and companies were starting to use this R&D, like microwave ovens, to sell to the public. I think it was DuPont. Forgive me if I'm wrong which company it is, but the slogan was better living through chemistry. We invented a whole bunch of cool stuff. I think it was about this time. I don't know if it was just before the 50s or just before the 60s, but we invented synthetic fabrics. So, the nylon we're using, you know, all that polyester stuff started coming better living through chemistry. Okay, back to the unions, because these aren't organized so great. In 1955, the two biggest labor unions, that they had been rivals, but the American Federation of Labor and the Congress of Industrial Organizations merged into super union. So by the 1950s, the groups realized they'd be much stronger and more effective as a single organization. No duh. That's like the meaning of union. So, and a man named George Meany was unanimously elected the first leader of this new AFL-CIO merged union. Okay, so I want you guys to look at this graph. This is workers represented by unions in the 1920s through Okay, I was going to say now, but it has been 20 years. So by the 1950s, a lot of people were joining unions. And so when these two unions merged, it skyrocketed. There was, what's it look like? 15 million people in the unions. But it started declining in the 80s. And Ronald Reagan in the 80s was very anti-union. When, in the 1980s, when the air traffic controllers went on strike, Reagan said, any air traffic controller that strikes, we're going to fire him. And he just wholesale, because the federal government is in charge of that part of aviation, he had the right and ability, he just sacked them all. They slowly brought some of them back in, but he was serious. He was very anti-union. But that's jumping ahead 30 years. Okay. So, better living through chemistry. We figured out how to treat bacterial infections. So, World War II was the first war in which we had antibiotics. So, before we had antibiotics, I think it was about an 80% death rate for someone who had a femur broken or like shot during the war. You were most likely, if your upper leg bone got broken, you're going to die of an infection. Miracle, we have penicillin, and we're able to fix that, and people started surviving much better. Most people don't die from broken legs now. Immunizations started happening. They were slowly coming in. So what was it? The disease that gives you lockjaw, tetanus. They had started tetanus immunizations, and they had a polio vaccine. So polio was this horrific disease. It wasn't rare. It wasn't even remotely uncommon. People were getting this all the time. My grandmother had it. President Roosevelt had it, and that's why he was in a wheelchair. Polio paralyzed different parts of people, depending on, I'm not sure exactly what part of their body decided how they were going to be paralyzed, but some people, their legs ended up paralyzed. Other people, arms. Other people, it was their lungs. So the next slide I'm going to show you is people with polio. So, but I want you to see how important these polio vaccines were. That's why I'm going to show you that picture. But people everywhere were having rising life expectancies. So not only were more babies happening, they were expected to live longer. And one talk about direct repercussions, our entire country, the population bloomed and they had more kids, and it changed our nation from this baby boom. Oh yeah, and pesticides were happening. DDT, we found out later, is horrific and causes all kinds of birth defects and is bad. But pesticides let us have more food to feed our growing population. So this is an iron lung ward. Iron lung is not the official term. It's Pulmotor is the name brand of this product. But people's lungs were being paralyzed, so they would put them in this pressure chamber, and it would breathe for them. So this is why we vaccinate, so we don't have things like this anymore. Okay. This seems like a painful transition, going from iron lungs to transistors. But vacuum tubes were huge back in the day, and now, I mean, like bigger than your fist type of huge. But now they're little tiny paperclip size things. So consumer goods were coming into households. Like things that were ridiculously huge were now getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Computers were still the size of rooms, but they were the size of normal building rooms as opposed to warehouses. So hooray. Televisions were starting to come into people's homes. They were still pretty expensive at the beginning of the 50s, and the screens were super small. but more and more and more people were transitioning to television from radio. So 1950, NASA is launching test rockets into space. And the reason our space program took off like it did, well, first of all, we knew we were going to need this missile technology. We took in a bunch of former Nazi scientists. Come on, we know you're sorry. Come join our space program. And we were doing this partially well, we knew we needed these rockets, but we also ramped up production because of Sputnik. Sputnik was a little metal thing about the size of a basketball, launched into orbit and was traveling over the United States. So the Soviet Union put the first satellite into space, and whoever dominated the skies could potentially send missiles that far. So that's when the space race happened. So we started NASA, we put the Apollo program in, and eventually got the space shuttle from it. But that's a good, 19 years before our initial rockets, and then we put a man on the moon. Consumer culture. Remember in my lecture about World War I and the repercussions of that is we learned how to do propaganda in World War I. And we had a good bit of time to develop it. And we got even better at it during World War II. And we took all this tech, we took all this ability to generate need, generate feelings in people, and we took it and put it into the ad agencies. And so there was a growth in the drive and push for consumer goods. We talk about keeping up with the Joneses, and because we're all doing better financially, there's a growth in consumer credit at the time too. So more and more people can buy, and they can buy on time. Not that there's any problem with buying on credit. Great Depression. Okay, so remember how I said suburbs were growing? Levitt was a designer of some of the suburbs, so most of them got called Levitt-town, or many of them got called Levitt towns based on this designer. More and more people were trying to move out of the city and move into these nice little castles, which they all had their lawns like little castles would. So there was a draw out of the cities. Look at me, I'm middle class. This is how we're supposed to live. And these suburbs were very segregated. Traditional gender norms, of course, were reinforced. Oh, dear heavens. I don't know if you want to, but type in sexist ads from the 1950s. Boy, they're painful. You should see them. But you've been warned. And remember how I said people were getting televisions? And so people were watching shows like Leave It to Beaver and these sitcoms set in these traditional suburbs. Well, what we were being told was traditional suburbs. And this started making people that are unable to buy houses in these suburbs really upset. It's like they're being shown, this is the American dream, this is how you're supposed to live, but I'm sorry, you're not allowed to be a part of this American dream. And this was kind of a rise in the civil rights movement. There started to be a real push now for it. This also happened in the 1980s in South Africa. So we were being affected here by Leave It to Beaver in the 1950s. In the 1980s, their segregation was really horrific, but people started watching The Cosby Show. Yes, I know. That's problematic. But at the time, we didn't know. So, The Cosby Show was an African-American doctor and his lawyer wife. in a nice suburban home with their children in college and all aspiring to have great middle-class careers. And in South Africa, the black Africans were seeing this and saying, oh, yeah, we've been told that we can't be educated. We've been told all these terrible things, and look at them. They have what we should have. And also, the white South Africans were seeing this and, wow, okay, maybe our bigotry was wrong. And the Cosby Show helped break down apartheid. So when people say that TV is the boob tube and is mindless entertainment and terrible, just think about Leave It to Beaver and the social implications. Just think about the Cosby Show. Think about social change brought about by these sitcoms. And so when people are saying to me now that there's too much LGBTQ representation on TV because it's not that much of the population, or look at the tokenism on TV where every show has to have Hispanic characters. It's like, yes, every show has to have representation because it does make a difference. Okay, I'll climb off my soapbox, and next slide. So, remember how I said people were scared of communists? Eisenhower represented a really strong force against communism. He represented the war hero, the general who will save us and protect us. And so, according to the electoral vote, he beat the heck out of Stevenson. Adelaide Stevenson being a member of Truman's cabinet. Popular vote, it was still a good, nice, solid election. It was a mandate for Eisenhower. He did well. One of the really cool things he did was put in place the interstate highway system. We realized that for our national defense, having fast interstate is really good. Okay, if you see the movie Cars, you'll see that there were terrible repercussions. Route 66 and these smaller towns were getting bypassed. So yes, that is bad. But the interstate highway system has been important and useful. Also expanded national parks, and people were starting actually to move towards more environmentally friendly activities, concerns. Sierra Club was important. As I said, art reflects the mind of the people of the time. And there was a lot of fear, a lot of disillusionment, a lot of confusion in the midst of all this optimism. We're living longer. We have better access to everything than we had in the past. So it's showing in the art. Catcher in the Rye was written at this time, and abstract art was becoming more and more common. Not the abstraction of the Impressionist, but really, truly abstract paintings, as you can see on the right corners. Look at the left corner. These Reinhardt paintings, there's 5 of them. They're 5 foot by 5 foot each. And they're called the Ultimate Black Paintings. And they're hanging in New York. And he describes it as pure, abstract, non-objective, timeless, spaceless, changeless, relationless, disinterested painting, an object that is self-conscious, ideal, transcendental, aware of no thing but art. They're 5 foot by 5 foot black squares, but it does reflect the cynicism that's going on at this point. There's also cinematic reflections of this. So starting in the 1950s, the Beat generation started rising up, inspiring a culture of nonconformity. Social revolution. The Rebel Without a Cause came out. There's this line from a movie. Hey Johnny, what are you rebelling against? What do you got? So you can see that there was just, why should I put myself in a suit and tie? This world that we've built could be destroyed at any minute through nuclear war, through our society just destroying itself. Why buy into this suit and tie business? So there was a rise in youth culture, in juvenile delinquency. And the youth market actually started becoming a thing at this time, too. So, the 1950s. Do yourself a favor. Look up Jailhouse Rock. Look up early Elvis stuff. But remember, when you're listening to this, like Sam Cooke was an influence. There were black origins, Motown origins to Elvis's music, but he was raised in an area where he was exposed to this music, and it was a part of him. He listened to gospel. He was in churches that used gospel music, and it went into his work, and he recognized, knew the origins of the music he was playing. So, the payola scandals. We trusted our government. We still trusted our government at this point. We trusted companies. We trusted, like, all these corporations and companies to do the right thing, to be honest. It wasn't until the late 60s that we stopped trusting very much. So the payola scandal really messed with our minds. And, okay. We thought, when we listened to the radio, the best songs were the ones getting played. The ones that were most popular were the ones getting played. But it turns out that these music producers were paying radio stations to play things over and over and over again until it was what we started craving hearing, which is how terrible songs like Achy Breaky Heart and Locomotion, and they weren't payola. But you see the point is it keeps getting played, and even when you hate it, you keep singing it. Anyway, the payola scandals reached this level of prominence and legal gravity in 1960, and Eisenhower called it an issue of public morality, and the Federal Communication Commission proposed a new law making payola, paying for playing stuff, a criminal act, because it was that impactful. It really did ruin our trust. Don't worry, we have a lot more things that ruin our trust later. So, okay. Remember I said Leave It to Beaver was showing how the suburbs and how we should, air quotes around should, be living. There was still persistent poverty. People living in the cities were too poor to get out of the cities. Caucasian Americans, Hispanics, blacks, Asians were still trapped in ghettoized areas, unable to get enough money to get out of these areas. There were shrinking job opportunities as inflation grew. People still were having a hard time finding work in a lot of these areas. So there was kind of two Americas. We had this affluent society selling us all this great stuff on credit, and then there were the have-nots, which couldn't get ahead. And the civil rights movement was growing. So I need you to know, you have to know, Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, overturned the 1898 Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy versus Ferguson said, yeah, separate but equals fine. You could do that. And the Brown versus Board of Education said separate but equal is inherently unequal, because all the money on all the tax money is going to these white schools, and these black schools are being left behind with 30-year-old books, substandard everything, the desks, the supplies. They weren't getting anything nearly as up to date or as well funded as the white schools. Thurgood Marshall was the lawyer for the NAACP. that argued before the Supreme Court. And he was then later, when he was much older, he became the first African American on the Supreme Court. So that had a nice, I don't know, pretty symmetry to it. Little Rock Nine were escorted into high school. This is later in 1957. And look at the woman behind the young lady trying to walk to school, yelling. People were protesting this. A lot of Southern schools chose to close down instead of integrating. And there was a resistance to this, obviously. In this picture, give me a second, I'm trying to remember. This is Vivian Malone, someone your age, a college undergraduate wanting to go to school, and she's trying to register for classes at the University of Alabama, and the governor of the state is standing there in the doorway. Bull Connor? No, that's not the name. But the governor of the state is standing there at the doorway blocking her from trying to register for classes. And this picture is in 1963, so even though Brown versus Education was 54, this was a slow process. The process of integrating buses was also a very slow process. All of it was. So, I don't have a year written here, but in Montgomery, Alabama, they had been wanting to make the buses be integrated where the African Americans that came into the bus didn't have to go to the back of the bus, that they could just sit wherever they wanted, wherever there was an empty seat. And like a year or two before Rosa Parks, there had been a young black woman, a 15-year-old, but she was an unwed mother. And so they didn't use it as a test case because they knew that she would be ripped up in the court of public opinion. Not fair, but that's the way it was. Rosa Parks was a member of a civil rights group, and she knew about this looking for someone for a test case. And just one day, she was coming home from work. She was a seamstress. She was respected in the white and black community. She had been working hard her whole life, and she was tired. And she sat in the seat and realized, it's me. I'm tired and don't want to get up. And she became, knowing full well what would happen, that she would get arrested. She became the test case. Young Martin Luther King Jr. was a preacher in another town, and he realized this too was his moment. He went and became a civil rights leader, seeing the need and seeing that he could do it. So these two people knew what they were getting into, and it's amazing that they walked into this full well knowing what they were walking into. I'm just staggered by their bravery. Okay. Speaking of Dr. King, I have a picture of him and his wife Coretta there in the middle just because I think it's a wonderful picture. You see them being serious so much that sweet moment I like there. But the entire country was becoming more affluent, and there was this growth in urban black middle class. Magazines were selling products to them. There was definitely a moment of affluence that was supported by the consumer culture, supported by our economic growth, and this helped a political mobilization of both the northern blacks, who had a lot more opportunities, and they helped the southern blacks and this civil rights movement against Jim Crow segregation, which was very different than what it the way it was in the North. There was still bigotry in the North, but it wasn't the same thing. So, this was an interesting phrase, and I'm pretty sure it was Eisenhower that said it, but I don't have my notes. What's good for General Motors is good for the United States, and what's good for the United States is good for General Motors. It probably was actually the chairman of General Motors that said it, but either way, what we're saying here, and this was the Republican mantra, is keeping the businesses running, keeping the economy fueling away, chugging along, will help our country be stronger. It'll help us against communist incursion. It'll keep us doing better. It'll make our country strong. So we understood we needed a Keynesian welfare state. We needed Social Security. We needed a lot of those New Deal reforms that Roosevelt and Truman put in place. But Eisenhower was also a fiscal conservative. So they're not rolling back too much of the New Deal, but they're not expanding on it at all. But even though the Republicans in Truman's time had Congress, and then Eisenhower and the Republicans had a lot of power, in the next midterm election, the Republicans didn't do nearly as well. So, survival of the welfare state, we kept what we needed out of the New Deal. Oh, remember I mentioned the Federal Highway Act? It's now called the Eisenhower Interstate System, but that was under Eisenhower. He did even better in his second election than his first against poor Stevenson. Okay, remember how I said in the last lecture that McCarthy had gone too far? He got to prominence saying, hey, I know who all these communists are. He never gave names. And then it was 1954. He said that the army was coddling communists, that they had them, that they were treating the communists well, that they were embedded in there. And people started thinking that, yeah, no, this is not the way it really is. Our army's there to defend us. Eisenhower would know if there were communists in the army, so no, that's not the way of it. So this political cartoon is great because the Republicans, the elephant, is soiled by the dirt of McCarthyism. And Senator Margaret Chase Smith is like, yeah, no, go upstairs, wash your hands. You're ruining the party. You're ruining everything. The Republicans need to clean up their act, and McCarthy's social credibility, political credibility just started falling out right there. This is the beginning of something called brinksmanship. John Foster Dulles would help lead us to the edge of nuclear war to push American political policy. Probably not the best in retrospect, considering how close we got to nuclear war, but they promised if the communists did anything we didn't like, we promised massive retaliation. Okay, the Vietnam War was in the 60s, but we were already kind of paying attention to this because the first Indochina War, or French Indochina War, was already happening. Vietnam was a French colony. Yes, because they're so damn close. But so, Vietnam, French colony, and they didn't like being a French colony. They kind of wanted free. So it was a civil war to throw off the colonial oppressors in their mind. They thought the best way to do it, and the best thing for them would be to go with the communists. And so France was in there trying to keep their colony. We were sending in advisors already. We ended up taking over this war later, but for now we were sending over advisors. So Vietnam was already happening in the 1950s. We just weren't engaged. We didn't have boots on the ground, as they say. Okay, so there was a lot of tense relations between the U.S., the First World, and the Soviet Union in their sphere, the Second World. So we were convinced there was a ton of Russian spies in the United States, and the Soviet Union was convinced there was a ton of American spies over there. And you know, they were kind of all right. So Francis Gary Powers was an American pilot, and he was flying a Lockheed U-2 reconnaissance plane over the Soviet territory in May 1960. I know, not the 1950s, but in May 60, he was flying over, and they shot him down. And we were terribly, terribly ticked off that they shot down our spy plane and took our pilot prisoner. And they were terribly, terribly ticked off that we are flying a spy plane over their sovereign territory. Dare I say they had a better argument there? He was sentenced to 10 years in prison for espionage. And we had a Soviet intelligence agent. His name was Abel. I don't have a first name for him. He had been found guilty of espionage 3 years earlier. And so we decided that we were going to trade their spy for our spy on the Brandenburg Bridge that unites East and West Germany. And I love this political cartoon just for its title, Better Relations Through Trade. So, yeah, that's interesting. So, yeah. And I'm closing by telling you I need you to watch this video. This is General Eisenhower in his closing remarks as he was leaving the presidency. And he warns of the military-industrial complex. It's like the Soviets are ramping up militarily, and so we're afraid. And we're spending money and having Lockheed Martin and having all these huge companies making only weapons before companies could transition and Ford could make plane motors, or these companies could be making weapons for us. But now, all these companies, their entire job is to just make weapons. And so you have these factories where they only make weapons, and then like all the different companies around them supply the employees of these companies. And what happens is we have the military-industrial complex where entire cities are based around these different defense contractors. And this is in 1961. He's warning us of this. He didn't say it in the words I did. I'm just showing what he was talking about, what it did lead to. Is imagine if Lockheed Martin closed. That entire town would lose all its industry, which means all the McDonald's would close down in that area. All the car washers and babysitters would be out of work. So if you were a senator or a congressman or some other politician from this area, would you ever vote against military defense contracts if that's the case? So I want you to think about the military-industrial complex and watch this video of his warning, because it really does touch us right now. So thank you for listening, and take care of yourselves until next time. Bye.